A young doctor enters the wrong room in the early hours of the morning at the hospital and sees a man next to a beautiful woman who has been intubated. But something he sees makes him run and call the police. The night in Los Angeles was gray and cold, with fine rain drawing crooked paths on the hospital windows. The wind howled between the buildings. Ethan tightened the strap of his backpack and took a deep breath before walking through the automatic doors. The smell of disinfectant and reheated coffee filled his lungs, but nothing seemed normal that night. The weight on Ethan's chest did not come only from fatigue or the long hours on call that awaited him. It was something deeper, denser, the kind of pain that is not relieved by time. It had been months since his father James had passed away, and yet his absence seemed to grow heavier every day. His father always said, "A doctor doesn't just save lives, son. He saves stories." Words that now seemed like a distant echo. The man who inspired him to put on that white coat was no longer there to see him grow up. In recent days, Ethan avoided looking at the dark hospital corridors, as if he might find his own fears there. He felt small in the face of the world's grandeur. He was physically and emotionally exhausted, but he couldn't afford to stop. His mother, Rosa, now depended on him. The bills were piling up, and he couldn't fail. So, swallowing the lump in his throat, he forced himself to keep going. The clock read 10 p.m., and the night promised to be long. The hospital dressing room was small and cold, lit by a fluorescent lamp that flickered from time to time. Ethan opened his locker, took out his gown, and began to change mechanically, as he did every night. But when he picked up his cell phone to check the time, he saw a notification on the screen, a message from his mother. "I'm proud of you, son. Don't forget to eat something." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that only he understood. His mother never complained, never asked for anything, but Ethan knew how hard she struggled to keep the house going after his father's death. He knew that on the other side of that screen was a woman who spent sleepless nights hoping that her son would not give in to exhaustion, sadness, or absence. He swallowed hard and pressed the cell phone against his chest for a few seconds, as if he could feel his mother's warmth in that message. He smiled, but it was a melancholy smile, one that hid nostalgia and fatigue. His stomach growled softly. He couldn't really remember the last time he had eaten something decent. He could go to the hospital cafeteria, maybe have a coffee and a slice of stale bread. But for some reason, he felt a different impulse. Maybe it was the weight of that rainy night. Maybe it was nostalgia for his father. Maybe it was something bigger that he didn't yet understand. Instead of going to eat, he decided to go to the emergency room. He couldn't explain why, but he felt he needed to be there. Something inside him told him that tonight, in that hospital, somewhere between the cold walls and silent corridors, there was something waiting for him. Perhaps it was the need to save someone, and feel that, in some way, he was saving his own father. The hospital was silent except for the distant sound of heart monitors and the hurried footsteps of nurses in the distance. Ethan walked through the corridors of the emergency room, feeling the weight of exhaustion on his shoulders. He knew that path with his eyes closed, but that night, something different caught his attention. A door that was slightly ajar. It was one of the rooms at the end of the hallway, but he didn't remember seeing it occupied before. The lights were on, and a cold breeze escaped through the crack, as if the environment itself were warning that something was not right there. He hesitated. He shouldn't be there. If it was a patient in critical condition, the doctors in charge would already know. But as he took another step, he felt a chill down his spine, an instinct he couldn't explain, pushing him forward. Taking a deep breath, Ethan slowly pushed the door open. Inside the room, white lights cast a cold glow on the bed, where a beautiful young woman lay intubated. Her pale, serene face was unconscious. Sitting next to her in a chair, a man in his 30s dressed in a dark suit leaned over her body, holding her hand firmly, too firmly, and whispered something close to her ear. His voice was low, but charged with something that made Ethan's stomach churn. He looked at the woman again. Something inside him stirred when he noticed a slight tremor in her fingers, almost imperceptible, as if she were trying to react, as if she were hearing everything, as if she were asking for help. It was then that Ethan realized that whatever was happening there, that woman wasn't safe. The silence of the room was only interrupted by the rhythmic sound of the machines. Ethan took a step forward, feeling a weight in his chest that he couldn't explain. Something was wrong. He didn't know exactly what, but he could feel it. His gaze fell to the heart monitor next to the bed. The graph oscillated gently, but then, for an instant, there was a spike in the frequency. Small, subtle, almost imperceptible, but real. He frowned. Why? His gaze returned to the woman on the bed. Her face was still pale and motionless, but could she be conscious? Trapped inside her own body? Trapped inside her own body? Unable to move or speak? The idea made Ethan's stomach churn. Did he not notice the change in her heartbeat? Or did he simply not care? The man's mouth was still moving in a whisper. Ethan held his breath and tried to catch a word, but all he got was a chill running down his back. His heart tightened. How many times had that man been there, saying things she didn't want to hear, doing things she couldn't avoid? How long had she been living in that silent terror? The monitor oscillated again. Ethan clenched his fists. He had to do something. He had to find out who that man was, and above all, he had to save that woman. The man slowly turned his face, as if only at that moment he had noticed Ethan's presence. His gaze swept over the young doctor's white coat before settling on his face, and then he smiled. But it was not a smile of relief or sadness. It was forced, cold, calculated. "She is my wife, Camila. I am only here to say goodbye." His voice was low and measured, as if each word had been chosen with care. He slowly released her hand, sliding his fingers over her skin, as if he wanted to leave an invisible mark. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. Something was wrong, very wrong. He looked at Camila. She remained motionless, her eyes closed, her lips parted as if she were fighting a nightmare from which she could not wake up. But the heart monitor continued to fluctuate, subtly, as if her body were reacting to the presence of that man. The silence in the room became unbearable. Needed to talk. He needed to break that suffocating atmosphere. What happened to her? His voice came out firm, but inside, he felt a sharp chill. The man tilted his head slightly, as if evaluating Ethan, then shrugged. It was a very tragic accident. Those words echoed in the room, but they brought no truth. A very tragic accident. But what kind of accident? When did it happen? Where? How? The man gave no details, because he didn't know, or because he didn't want to tell. Ethan's throat went dry. He felt his skin crawl. Something inside him told him that if he simply accepted that answer, he would be letting Camila die without even trying to save her. The heart monitor oscillated again. The young doctor took a deep breath and thought that maybe the man was lying. The man kept talking, spouting empty words, rehearsed phrases, as if trying to fill the silence with well-calculated lies. But Ethan was no longer listening. His gaze was fixed on Camila's wrist. The sleeve of her hospital pajamas had ridden up slightly. When the man let go of her hand for a brief moment, something became visible, and it was enough to freeze Ethan's blood. A purple mark. It wasn't a simple bruise. It wasn't accidental. It was a sign of force, of pressure, of aggression. Ethan's heart raced. He swallowed, feeling a chill slowly up his back like a silent warning that he was facing something much bigger than it seemed. He looked at the man, who still had that forced smile and meticulously controlled tone of voice. But now Ethan could see beyond the facade. Camila was not just a patient in critical condition. She was a victim. And the question that exploded in Ethan's mind was what else was that man hiding? The young doctor's breathing became heavy. He needed to get out of there. He needed to think. He needed to discover the truth before it was too late. The room seemed to get smaller with every passing second. The rhythmic sound of Camila's heart monitor now sounded like a muffled scream. Ethan could feel his own heart pounding against his ribs, adrenaline rushing through his veins, but that man was watching, evaluating. Ethan could sense it. If he showed any nervousness, if he gave any sign that he had noticed something could be dangerous. Then, in one quick movement, he took his cell phone out of his pocket and pretended to answer a call. "Yes, I'm on my way right now." The man raised his eyebrows, analyzing him. Ethan didn't wait. He put his cell phone away, smiled slightly, and left the room, walking calmly as if it were just another normal night at the hospital. But as soon as he turned the corner and was out of that man's field of vision, he quickened his pace. The hospital was silent at that hour. Few people walked the halls. Nurses whispered reports to each other, and patients slept behind closed doors. But Ethan couldn't rest. Fear closed in with the certainty that something very bad was happening. Who was that man? Why was Camila there? If he really was her husband, why was there a mark on her wrist? It looked like a cry for help. He hurried through the halls until he reached the hospital security room. Inside, a uniformed guard was checking some surveillance cameras. "Good evening, Alejandro. I need your help," said Ethan, trying to keep his voice steady. The guard looked up from the monitor. "What's going on, doctor? There's a man in room 407 who says he's the patient's husband, but..." Ethan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "It wasn't visiting hours. I want to know who authorized his entry. I want to see the recordings." The guard frowned but nodded, typed something into the computer, and checked the images from the reception area. Ethan held his breath, his eyes scanning the screen intently. People coming and going, employees greeting visitors, nurses passing by. But then a chill ran down his spine. The images advanced minute by minute, but there was no sign of that man entering. Nothing. No record. No identification. No movement showing how he had gotten to Camila's room. This doesn't make sense," Ethan muttered. The guard also seemed confused. "Are you sure he's still there?" Ethan looked at the screen and then at the dark hallway behind him. Now he was sure of something. That man shouldn't be there. And if he didn't come in through the main door, where did he come in? The young doctor felt a chill down his spine. He had to act fast before that man disappeared. The hospital reception area was monitored 24 hours a day. Every visitor, companion, or employee had to identify themselves. But no matter how much they reviewed the images, no matter how much they searched for another angle, there was no record of his entry. He was inside, but how? The young doctor ran his hand over his face, trying to organize his thoughts. Maybe it was a system error, maybe a camera malfunction, but deep down, he knew that wasn't it. He knew he was facing something much worse. He took a deep breath. That man wasn't registered at the entrance. "That means he entered without authorization," Ethan said, his voice full of urgency. "He's in room 407, alone with a patient in critical condition." The guard frowned. Without hesitation, he picked up the radio and alerted the team immediately. "We have an unidentified individual inside the hospital. Initiating security protocol." Ethan felt a chill down his spine. Something terrible was happening. He was sure of it. And now the only question that tormented him was whether he had arrived in time to prevent the worst. Time seemed to be running out for Ethan. His footsteps echoed in the hallway as he hurried along with the security team. Fear tightened his chest. What if he had gone too far? What if he was wrong? But deep down, he knew he wasn't. When he reached the room, Ethan pushed the door open urgently, his heart almost jumping out of his chest. The strong smell of hospital alcohol and medicine filled every corner. But now, there was something else. An unsettling emptiness. The chair where the man had been sitting was still slightly moved, making it clear that someone had been there just a few moments ago. But now, the space next to Camila's bed was empty. She was still the same, fragile, intubated, her breathing controlled by machines. He wondered if she might be conscious, and afraid. The question squeezed his heart like an icy chain. He took a step forward and took her hand. Her fingers were cold. "Camila, can you hear me?" His voice came out almost as a whisper. No response. Only the constant beeping of the machines. Behind him, the guards began to move. One of the guards went straight to the bathroom in the room. Another checked the window as if that man had simply vanished into thin air. Nothing. He wasn't there. There were no signs of escape or evidence that he had even been in that room. "I'm going to take a look around the hospital," said one of the guards over the radio. "Notify the team. That guy could be anywhere." Ethan looked at Camila again. The purple mark on her wrist was still there, the only proof that this wasn't a nightmare. But where was that man? And more importantly, would he come back? He looked at her, fragile, alone, scared, and at that moment, something inside him changed. He wasn't just a young doctor. He wasn't just a young man trying to move on after his father's death. In that instant, he became something more, the only person who could fight for her. If he gave up, who else would care? Security searched the hospital. The man had disappeared without a trace. But Ethan knew this wasn't over yet. There were still too many unanswered questions. He swallowed hard, feeling a lump in his throat. Could Camilla hear him somewhere inside that sleep? She knew he was there. She looked down at her hand, still cold, still weak, and it was at that moment that he felt an inexplicable impulse. Gently, he took her hand in his and, without thinking twice, promised, "I'm going to find out what happened to you." The phone seemed heavy in Ethan's hands. Every second of waiting while the call was transferred to the police felt like a pounding of anxiety in his chest. He needed answers. He needed to know who the man was who had been in Camilla's room. When the police officer's voice finally came on the line, Ethan took a deep breath and told him everything. The mysterious man, the purple mark on the patient's wrist, her disappearance without a trace. There was a silence that was too long, too uncomfortable. "Her name?" asked the police officer. "Camilla. I don't know her last name yet, but the man said he was her husband." A few more seconds of silence passed. Ethan felt his stomach churn. It was as if the police officer already knew, as if that name was familiar to him. And then he finally spoke. "If it's who I'm thinking of, her husband's name is Luis. Luis Harris." The name echoed in Ethan's mind like a warning. "Do you know him?" Ethan asked in a lower voice, almost fearing the answer on the other end of the line. The police officer sighed. "We have records on him. Several reports of domestic violence, most of them by Camilla herself." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. He was arrested. There was a bitter laugh on the other end of the line. There was never enough evidence. He always got away and always came back to her. The weight of those words fell on Ethan like a punch to the stomach. Camilla tried to call for help. She screamed, but no one heard her. And now she was there alone, intubated, silenced. But Ethan wasn't going to leave her without a voice. He clenched his fists. No matter what he had to do, he was going to stop Luis from hurting her again. This time, Camilla was no longer alone. The hospital felt colder than usual. The white hallway, the sounds of the monitoring machines, the smell of disinfectant. None of that had bothered Ethan before, but now every detail felt like a weight on his chest. He was sitting in front of a computer in the records room, the blue screen reflecting his tense face. He needed answers. If the police already knew Luis, then why was Camilla still paying the price? Why didn't anyone protect her before? His fingers typed her name, Camilla Harris. The file appeared before his eyes. He clicked on it. The medical report opened, and what he read turned his stomach. Admitted unaccompanied, unconscious, multiple traumas. Fracture in the right arm, not consistent with impact from accident. Superficial cuts on the face and abdomen. Multiple contusions on the wrists and ribs. Old injuries in different stages of healing. Ethan felt the bile rise in his throat. These were not injuries from a simple accident. This woman was not a victim of bad luck. She was a victim of someone. He ran his hands over his face, trying to breathe deeply. How many times had Camilla felt pain before she got there? How many times had she been silenced? His chest burned with indignation. He knew the truth, but now he had to prove it. Because if he failed, Camilla might never have the chance to tell her own story. Ethan walked away from the computer, feeling a suffocating knot in his chest. He needed air. He needed anything to relieve the oppression that now imprisoned him inside. But nothing relieved it. The words of the medical report still echoed in his mind. Fractures, bruises, old injuries. Camilla wasn't just hospitalized. She was scarred, and Ethan knew what that meant. He knew what it was like to live with pain that no one could see. He remembered his mother, Rosa, struggling to hide her tears after his father's death. He remembered the silent pain in her eyes, the invisible weight she carried, and now he saw that same weight in Camilla. She couldn't speak, but her body told a story that no one had wanted to hear before. Tears welled up without him being able to stop them. They weren't just for Camilla. They were for all women like her, for all those who cried out and no one listened, for all those who fled and were found, for all those who suffered and were forced to forgive, for all those who didn't get a second chance. He wiped his tears with the sleeve of his gown and looked at the computer screen once more. The rage burned inside him stronger than the fear. Camilla was still alive, and as long as she breathed, Ethan would do everything in his power to ensure she had a future. He closed his eyes and whispered as if talking to her. even though she couldn't hear him. No one deserves to go through this, and I won't let it go unpunished. At that moment, Ethan was no longer just a doctor. He was Camila's only hope. The sun had barely risen on the horizon when Ethan received the news. Luis had been found. The information came through a police officer who entered the hospital with firm steps and a serious look. We managed to locate him. Ethan's heart beat strongly. Where? At the bus terminal. He was trying to leave the city. Luis was going to run away. It was obvious. He knew what he had done. He knew that this time, Camila was no longer alone. Ethan felt a mixture of relief and indignation. He couldn't escape. Not again. But instead of feeling victory, he felt a weight on his chest. Camila still couldn't tell her story. What if Luis lied and got away with it again? He looked toward the room where Camila lay motionless. She had fought for so long, but now he had to fight for her. Luis was at the police station, sitting calmly as if it were all just a misunderstanding. "Yes, I know Camila," he said, crossing his arms with an expression of false indignation. "She's my wife." His tone of voice was rehearsed, as if he were just a man who had been unjustly accused. "I just wanted to see her. I was desperate. I didn't know what to do." He sighed, feigning sadness. "But I would never hurt her. Camila had an accident. It was terrible. I just wanted to take care of my wife." The police officer looked at him silently for a long moment. "If you're not guilty, why were you fleeing the city?" Luis let out a dry laugh. "Fear. Fear of being accused of something I didn't do. You know how it is these days. These days anything is grounds for an accusation." The silence in the room was heavy. Luis lied without hesitation, as if he had done so all his life, as if he were sure he would get away with it once again. The police officer closed the folder in front of him and stood up. "Let's see if your version matches the evidence." Luis kept his confident smile, like someone who already knew the end of that story. The news hit Ethan like a blow to the chest. Luis could be released. The police officer explained in a serious but tired voice, "Without evidence, we can't hold him for long. He'll be out in a few hours." Ethan's mind raced. How was it possible? A man who already had a history of violence, who tried to flee, who was alone with Camila while she was vulnerable. He still had a chance to escape. He clenched his hands tightly, trying to contain his frustration. If Luis got out, he would come back. That was obvious. He would not accept losing control over Camila. He would come back to finish what he started. Ethan felt despair rising in his throat. What if this time it was too late? What if Camila never woke up? He looked at her, motionless, caught between life and death, and then he knew. If no one was going to protect her, he would. Luis could only be stopped with evidence, something that would convict him once and for all, and Ethan would do whatever it took to find that evidence, because now, Camila's life depended on it. The time that followed was long and exhausting. Ethan hardly slept, spending hours in the hospital corridors between medical reports and calls to the police, trying to find any clue, any detail that could prevent Luis from going unpunished. But the evidence remained weak, and in the midst of it all, he never stopped visiting Camila. She was still there, between life and emptiness. But then, on a quiet night, something changed. Ethan was by her side as always when he noticed a subtle movement. Her fingers trembled. She opened her eyes in surprise, holding her breath. Camila. Nothing. But then another sign. Her eyelashes moved. Her breathing became a little irregular. The heart monitor fluctuated. She was fighting. He took her hand, feeling an inexplicable emotion rise in his chest. After all, after so much silence, Camila was reacting. It was the first time since that night that Ethan felt hope. The next morning, as he was adjusting Camila's sheets, something caught his attention. Among the cables and bandages, there was a small pendant hanging from her delicate neck, small enough to go unnoticed. He hesitated, but then very carefully opened the pendant. Inside was a photo, an image that made Ethan's heart tighten. Camila was smiling, and beside her was a brown-haired girl no more than 5 years old. He felt a chill. Who was that girl? His blood ran cold when a thought crossed his mind. If Luis was capable of hurting Camila, where was that girl now? The pendant was still between Ethan's fingers when he felt a weight on his chest. The girl in the photo. Who was she? He needed to find out. If Camila couldn't speak, He would speak for her. That's when he remembered security guard Alejandro. If anyone knew the hospital records, it was him. In a few minutes, the two were in front of the security computer. Ethan held the pendant as if it could guide him to the answer. "Does she have family? Someone who can take care of her?" Ethan asked, his voice full of urgency. Alejandro typed quickly, then stopped. "Here's a contact. Valeria Harris, the patient's sister." The name gave him immediate relief, but also fear. Valeria knew what had happened. She was also in danger. Without wasting any time, Alejandro made the call. No one answered on the first ring, silence on the second. On the third, a trembling, anguished voice answered on the other end of the line. "Hello, Mrs. Valeria. This is Alejandro from hospital security. Your sister Camila is here." The phone went silent. "Mrs. Valeria," then they heard it. A sob, a stifled cry. "She's alive!" The woman's voice came out in a broken cry. "For God's sake, she's alive!" Alejandro looked at Ethan, who felt his heart tighten. That woman had already lost hope. "She's alive, but we need you to come to the hospital as soon as possible." The phone fell. The line went dead. Valeria arrived at the hospital in despair, her eyes red, her breathing ragged. And then, when she saw Camila lying in that bed, connected to cables and tubes, she collapsed. "My sister!" Her voice broke into a deep sob. Ethan held her by the shoulders, trying to calm her down. "She's reacting. She's coming back, but I need you to tell me." He hesitated. "Who is the girl in the photo on the necklace?" Valeria wiped her face with trembling hands. And then, her voice full of pain, she replied, "Her name is Sophia. She's 5 years old. Where is she?" Time seemed to stand still. Camila wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting to get her daughter back, and Ethan knew at that moment that he had to find her. Valeria was still trembling when she sat down next to Camila's bed. Her hands caressed her sister's cold fingers, and silent tears fell onto the white sheets. Ethan sat down next to her, waiting. He knew she needed a moment to gather her strength before telling the truth. Then, with a trembling voice, she began to speak. Luis was never a good man. Her voice was a bitter whisper. He isolated Camila, made her lose friends, made her fight with her family. Every time she tried to leave, he did something worse, until one day he found the best way to trap her. Sophia. Ethan's chest tightened. He threatened to take her daughter away. Valeria nodded, her eyes shining with pain. He said that if Camila left, she would never see Sophia again. To see Sophia, he said he knew people, that justice would never support a woman like her. The words were harsh and real. That's how men like Luis operated, not only with physical violence, but with fear and control. And then, one day, Valeria took a deep breath, as if she were drowning. "She disappeared from my life." Ethan's eyes widened. "She disappeared." Valeria nodded. "She sent me a message saying that I should no longer contact her, that I was forbidden to see her and her daughter, that if anything happened, she would take Sophia and run away. But after that, silence. I couldn't talk to her anymore. She didn't answer the phone. She wasn't at home." Ethan's stomach churned. Sophia's name, her aunt, was in Ethan's mind like an alarm. Where was she? Who was she with? He felt the weight of responsibility grow like a storm in his chest. He had to find her without hesitation. His cell phone and called the police officer he had spoken to before. "This is Ethan. We need an urgent search." "What is it about?" The voice on the other end sounded tired. "Camila Harris has a daughter, Sophia, 5 years old." There was a silence. "And where is that girl?" Ethan's blood ran cold. "No one knows." The line went dead. For a second. "We'll investigate right now." Ethan's heart was racing. He looked at Camila, still caught between life and death. She tried to run away for Sophia. She tried to save her. Now he would finish what she started. The early morning hours passed, and the hospital remained silent. The only sound in Camila's room was the rhythmic beeping of the monitors, a constant reminder that she was still there, still breathing, still fighting. Ethan didn't move from her side for a second. He knew Camila was reacting. He knew that at any moment she could wake up, but when that happened, he wasn't prepared for the avalanche of emotion that came with it. It was a small movement, a slight tremor in her fingers. Ethan blinked, his heart racing, and then Camila's eyes opened. the light in the room reflected in her brown eyes. Still cloudy, still confused. She blinked several times as if trying to understand where she was, as if her mind needed to piece together what had happened. But she was there, alive, fighting. Ethan felt tears burning in his eyes. He took her hand firmly and leaned closer. "It's okay, Camilla." His voice trembled with emotion. "You're safe now." Camilla's eyes moved slowly, focusing on Ethan's face. He saw the fear, he saw the pain, but above all, he saw the memory of something much greater than all that. Her lips parted, weak and trembling, and then, in a whisper that broke Ethan inside, she said only one name: Sophia, my daughter. It was as if all the pain she carried was contained in those words. She didn't ask where she was. She didn't ask what happened. She already knew. She knew her daughter was far away. Ethan felt a lump tighten in his throat. He held her hand tighter, as if he could transfer his own strength to that fragile body. And then, without hesitation, he made the only promise that really mattered. "I'll bring your daughter back. I swear." Camilla's eyes glistened with silent tears. She couldn't say anything else, but in that moment, she believed him. It was after 3 a.m. when Ethan's phone rang. His heart was already pounding before he answered. "Dr. Ethan," said the voice of the police officer on the other end of the line. "We found Sophia." He sat up straight in his chair, feeling the adrenaline rush through his body. "Where is she? Is she okay?" There was a pause. "She's scared, but she's alive." Air finally entered his lungs, but his concern did not disappear. "Where?" "At the house of a babysitter Luis hired." The name of that man made Ethan close his eyes for a second. He knew Luis would not leave Sophia unattended, but a babysitter? What did she know? What had he told her? "Let's go there. I need someone from the family to come and get her before the call ended." Ethan was already dialing Valeria's number. Minutes later, the two were in the car, speeding across the city. The silence between them was filled with worry. Valeria's eyes were filled with tears, and she clenched her hands to keep them from shaking. "I promised Camilla I'd bring her back," Ethan murmured. Valeria just nodded. She knew he meant it. When they arrived at the address, the house was small with dim lights illuminating the windows. The street was silent, as if the world did not yet know what was happening inside. The door opened slowly, and a police officer came out holding Sophia's hand. She was so small, her brown eyes wide open, full of fear, as if she did not yet know whether she could trust those who were there. She held a doll tightly, as if it were her last link of security in the world. Valeria let out a trembling sigh when she saw her. Sophia, the girl, looked up, recognizing the voice. Her eyes shone with something different, a flash of relief, but she did not move. Ethan stepped forward and crouched down to her level. "Hello, Sophia. I'm Ethan. Your mom is waiting for you." The girl's lips trembled. She did not cry, but she was close to it. She pressed the doll against her chest and shook her head slightly. "Do you want to see your mom?" he asked gently. Sophia hesitated, then slowly nodded. That was enough. Valeria couldn't take it anymore. She ran to her niece and hugged her tightly, and it was then that Sophia broke down. Silent tears finally flowed, soaking her aunt's coat. She sobbed quietly, hiding her face in Valeria's shoulder, because for the first time in days, she was in the arms of someone who truly loved her. The drive back to the hospital was silent, but full of emotion. Sophia held the doll in one hand and Valeria's in the other. Her eyes, still tired from crying so much, looked out the window as if she were still trying to understand everything that had happened. Ethan, sitting next to her, watched the girl in the rearview mirror. She was so fragile, but at the same time so strong. How many nights had she spent waiting for her mother to return? How many times had she wondered if they would take her away forever? When they arrived at the hospital, Ethan felt his heart race. He knew how much that moment meant. He got out of the car first and opened the door for Sophia. She looked at him, and before letting go of her aunt's hand, Ethan smiled. "Let's go see your mom." The girl took a deep breath and nodded. The hospital was silent that night. The white hallways reflected the cold light from the streetlights, creating soft shadows on the floor. But inside that room, something much greater than silence was about to happen. Camilla was sitting on the bed, still connected to the cables and monitors. Her face was pale, her eyes tired but alive. Alive in a way they hadn't been in a long time. She looked toward the door as if every beat of her heart was a countdown, as if she knew that at any second, the moment she had waited so long for would finally arrive. Across the hall, Sophia walked alongside Valeria, holding her aunt's hand, a worn doll pressed to her chest. Sophia, the little girl, hadn't said a word since they got out of the car. She seemed to be holding her breath, her little heart beating too hard inside her chest. Because after so many days of fear, after so many nights of not knowing if she would ever return home, she was going to see her mother. The door to the room was pushed open carefully, the light from the hallway illuminating the scene in front of her. And then Sophia's eyes met Camila's. It was as if time had stopped. Not a single word was spoken, but everything was already there. Sophia, so small, so fragile, remained motionless for a moment, as if she didn't believe what she was seeing. Camila brought a hand to her mouth, and tears rolled down her cheeks before she could stop them. Sophia. Her voice was a broken whisper. That was enough. In a second, Sophia was running, her feet hurriedly pounding the cold hospital floor, her heart beating even faster, and then she jumped into her mother's arms. "Mommy!" Her cry was a release, a relief, a contained anguish. Camila held her with force, burying her face in her daughter's hair, her weak body trembling with tears. "My love, my love." The room filled with sobs. Sophia's small hands clung to her mother's blouse, as if she were afraid to let go and have everything disappear. "I thought you weren't coming back." The girl's voice came out choked against her mother's chest. Camila closed her eyes, feeling her heart break and rebuild itself at the same time. "I'll never leave you alone again. Never again outside." Ethan leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. He felt the tears coming, but he didn't care, because there, in that small hospital room, a love had won. The room was still enveloped in that silent emotion that only real and profound moments can bring. Sophia was still clinging to her mother's body, with her little face buried in her chest, as if she were afraid that Camila would disappear if she let go, as if she needed to feel her breathing to believe it was real. Camila, although weak and still fragile, did not let go of her daughter for a single second. She closed her eyes, letting the tears fall as she buried her face in the girl's soft hair. Her scent was still the same, the scent of her daughter, whom she thought she would never see again. The weight of that embrace was more than physical. It was the weight of fear, finally leaving after so many nights of pain, after so much suffocating silence, after everything she thought she had lost. Sophia was there in her arms, and Camila felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Security, the security she herself never had, the security she now gave her daughter. Although her voice was weak and her throat was dry from crying, she managed to whisper, "I will never leave you alone again." Sophia's little body trembled against hers, and the girl shook her head frantically, as if to say, "I know." She knew because, for the first time, she felt that she was truly home. Outside, leaning against the cold hospital wall, Ethan closed his eyes. He felt the tears coming, but he didn't try to stop them because he knew what that moment meant. It wasn't just a reunion. It wasn't just a hug. It was a promise that no force in the world could break. Camila was no longer the fragile woman he had found in that bed, fighting between life and death. Now she was alive. Now she was a mother who had come back for her daughter, and Ethan knew it right then, in that split second when time seemed to stand still. It had all been worth it. The days passed slowly, but this time they were not days of uncertainty. Camila was recovering little by little. The physical marks were disappearing, but the invisible scars were still there. Even so, she refused to live in fear again, because now she was no longer alone. Sophia was by her side. Valeria held her hand every time she hesitated, and Ethan was always there. But there was something he still had to do, something that couldn't wait any longer. Luis was still in prison, but for how long? Camila knew that story. She had escaped before. She remembered all the times she went to the police station to report him, her hands trembling, her voice breaking. She remembered when they told her there wasn't enough evidence. She remembered the threats, the looks of contempt, Luis's cold laughter when she returned home, knowing that justice would never be on her side. But now it was different, because for the first time, she was no longer silent, and she wasn't going to back down. That morning, Ethan took her to the police station. It was the first time she had set foot in that place without feeling invisible. Valeria was by her side. Ethan too. But above all, she had herself. And this time, she wasn't going to speak with fear. They took her to a private room where the police officer on duty looked at her intently. Camila Harris took a deep breath, holding his gaze firmly. "Yes, I want to file a formal complaint against Louise Harris for assault, kidnapping, and attempted murder." The officer nodded, taking a form. But before he could say anything, Camila continued, "And this time I have evidence." She placed a folder on the table with Ethan's medical reports, the images of the marks on her body, Valeria's testimony, and above all, the record of all the previous complaints. This time, Louise couldn't say it was a misunderstanding. This time, he would have nowhere to run. The police officer's words fell like a weight lifting from Camila's chest. She closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing it all. How many years had she waited to hear those words? How many nights had she dreamed of this moment? But she always woke up in a nightmare. Now it was real. Louise would be imprisoned. He would never touch her again. He would never threaten Sophia again. He would never make another woman go through what she had gone through. She opened her eyes and found Ethan looking at her with that discreet smile, that look that said, "I told you you could do it." And for the first time, she believed it, because now she was finally free. Time passed. The gray days gave way to lighter mornings, and the nights that had once been filled with fear were now as nights. Camila was recovering completely. Her steps were firm again. Her once dull gaze was shining once more. She was no longer the fragile, lost woman Ethan had found that night in the hospital. She had been reborn, but the scars were still there, and perhaps they always would be. The difference was that now they would not define her. That day, Ethan went to visit her, this time not as a doctor, but as himself. When he arrived at the small apartment where Camila and Sophia lived with Valeria, he sensed something different in the air. It was no longer a place filled with fear and uncertainty. It was a home. The door was opened by Sophia, who jumped into his arms without hesitation. "Dr. Ethan!" He laughed, holding her easily. "You've grown since I last saw you. Mom says it's because I'm happy now." Her answer took him by surprise. He looked to see who was standing there in the doorway watching the scene, smiling. Ethan understood in that moment that everything had changed, not only for Camila and Sophia, but also for him. That night they had dinner together. It was the first time Ethan saw Camila laugh genuinely. It was no longer that hesitant, broken laugh full of fear. It was light and natural. After Sophia fell asleep on the sofa hugging her doll, Camila sat down next to him. "You don't ask me how I am anymore." He frowned. "Why did you expect me to ask?" She smiled. "For a long time, yes. But now I can answer that myself." She took a deep breath and looked at her daughter, who was sleeping peacefully. "I'm fine, Ethan. For the first time in a long time, I'm fine." He didn't respond immediately. He just watched the peace on her face and felt something inside him finally calm down. How many nights had he spent without sleep? How times had he doubted that he was doing the right thing? How many times had he feared for Camila, for Sophia, for himself? Now everything made sense. He looked at Camila and Sophia and saw something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The world was still cruel. There was still pain. There was still injustice. But in that room lit by the dim light of the lamp, love had won, and Ethan knew that somehow he would always be part of that story. The months passed like a sigh, but this time did not take away only bad memories. Camila was no longer the woman who woke up in a hospital without knowing if she would survive the next day. Now she had a purpose, and that purpose was born out of pain. She could simply go on with her life, take care of Sophia, and forget everything she had been through. But what about the women who were still trapped in fear, and those who woke up every day next to a man like Luis, without knowing if they would see tomorrow? She couldn't close her eyes, because one day she also needed someone to fight for her life. And if Ethan hadn't seen the signs, and if he had ignored that room, that man next to her bed, maybe she wouldn't be here now. And now it was her turn to make a difference. That's how the idea came about. A shelter. A place where women like her could find protection. where mothers could take care of their children without fear, where the pain of the past would no longer determine anyone's future. Camila didn't know where to start. She had never managed anything before. She knew nothing about bureaucracy or costs, but she knew it was necessary. So she started little by little, first gathering women who had already been through similar situations. Then she found a community space where they could offer support, psychological assistance, and legal advice. And then something she never imagined began to happen. Women started to arrive, sometimes in the early hours of the morning, afraid, carrying only a bag and with a lost look in their eyes. Other times they came in secret, trying to understand if it was possible to live without fear, and they all had the same question in their eyes. Can I escape? Camila took their hands and told them with the firmness that only someone who has survived can have. Yes, you can. I am proof of that. She saw women who arrived broken rebuild themselves. She saw mothers who didn't know where to go find a home. She saw children who would grow up without having to feel fear. And for the first time, she understood the true meaning of the word strength, because strength was not just about surviving. It was about turning pain into hope for others. Sophia, with her childlike innocence, saw all this without fully understanding it. But one day Camila found her sitting on the floor of the shelter, drawing. Curious, she crouched down next to her daughter. What are you doing, my love? Sophia lifted the drawing, smiling proudly. There was a colorful house, many women and children drawn around it, and in the middle of it all was Camila. This is the place where you save moms, said Sophia with a smile, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Camila felt her eyes fill with tears because, yes, that was exactly what she was doing. She was saving moms, and deep down, she was also saving herself. Life went on, but none of the people in that story continued as before. Camila was now fully recovered physically. The marks had disappeared, but inside, something much bigger had changed. She was no longer the woman who walked with her head down, feeling that her life had no value. Now she knew who she was, and above all, she knew the impact her story could have on the lives of other women. The shelter grew every day. New people arrived. Some stayed for weeks, others only for a few hours, until they had the courage to take the first step towards a new life. And Camila was there for each of them. But even though she was always surrounded by people, there was someone she never strayed far from. Ethan. He continued with his life, continuing his studies, spending sleepless nights between books and hospital shifts. The hospital demanded everything he had, and sometimes he felt that the weight of so many lives in his hands was too much. But every time he thought about giving up, every time he wondered if he was really making a difference, a message would arrive. Sometimes it was just a thank you in the middle of the day. Other times, photos of the women's shelter who had found a new opportunity, and occasionally little notes written by Sophia full of colorful hearts and crooked letters for Ethan. Thank you for saving my mom. Every time he read those words, he felt a lump in his throat because, without realizing it, he wasn't just the doctor who saved Camila. He became part of their lives, and they part of his. Visits to the shelter became frequent. Ethan told himself it was just out of curiosity, just to see how Camila was doing, but deep down, he knew he went, because that place reminded him why he had chosen medicine. It wasn't just about saving bodies. It was about saving stories, about giving a second chance to someone who no longer believed in herself. And on one of those visits, he and Camila sat on the terrace watching Sophia playing with other girls from the shelter. For a moment, no one said anything until Camila smiled and looked at him. Have you realized how all this started? He frowned, not understanding. She laughed softly with an open door. Ethan blinked, and then he understood. That night at the hospital, he could have ignored that half-open door. He could have continued on his way without noticing that inside that room, there was a woman who needed to be saved. And that's why nothing was ever the same again. He looked at Camila and smiled, because now he knew that some doors should never be ignored. That morning began like any other. Ethan was at the hospital, lost among files, tests, and patients who needed urgent attention. The work was exhausting. The sleepless nights were countless, but he was used to it. What he didn't know was that this morning would bring something he would never forget. He was about to leave the break room when he heard the receptionist calling him. "Dr. Ethan, you have a visitor." He frowned. "A visitor? Who?" The woman just smiled and pointed down the hall. He turned, still confused, and then he stood motionless in the middle of the hospital, holding a doll in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. She was wearing a little blue dress and her hair was pulled back into 2 neat braids. This time, she didn't seem scared. It took Ethan a second to react, but then he walked toward her, still trying to understand what was happening. "Sophia, what are you doing here?" She smiled shyly and handed him the paper. "I made a drawing for you." He took the paper carefully, and as soon as he saw what was there, he felt the air leave him. It was a child's drawing made with colored crayons, but what was depicted there was much more than simple scribbles. There were 3 figures holding hands: a woman, a girl, and a man in a white coat. At the bottom, in small, crooked letters, it said, "Thank you for saving my mom." Ethan looked at Sophia, feeling a lump in his throat. "You drew this?" She nodded enthusiastically. "Mom says you helped us to be together again, so I made this drawing so you'll never forget." Her words hit Ethan like a punch in the chest because at that moment, he realized something he had never thought about. He had always believed that saving lives meant preventing death, but now, looking at that little girl holding his doll with such happiness, he saw that saving a life went far beyond that. He had not only kept Camila alive, he had given her daughter back her mother, and that was worth more than any title. He bent down to Sophia's level, still holding the drawing as if it were a treasure. "It's the best gift I've ever received." The girl's face lit up with a smile, and for the first time since that night in the hospital, he felt that it had all been worth it. Ethan remained kneeling in front of Sophia, holding that little drawing as if it were the most valuable prize he had ever received in his life. He had already conducted important medical examinations and read reports that decided the fate of patients, but nothing had ever meant as much as that simple piece of paper. Sophia smiled innocently, unaware of the impact her words had had on him. At that moment, Ethan realized something he had never considered before. He had changed a life, not only Camila's, but also Sophia's, and as a result, his own. Sophia was still looking at him, waiting for a reaction, so Ethan took a deep breath, holding back the tears that wanted to come out, ran his hand through the girl's hair, and smiled. "Sophia, did you know that no one has ever given me such a special gift before?" She opened her eyes in surprise. "Never, never." He shook his head. "I'm going to keep this drawing forever." Sophia's smile grew even wider, and then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, she threw herself into his arms and hugged him. "I like being with you, Dr. Ethan." The hug was short, but it meant more than 1,000 words, and Ethan, for the first time in a long time, felt a different warmth in his chest because he finally understood. In the darkest moments, on the days when he wondered if it was all worth it, during the endless shifts, in the early mornings of doubt, in those times when he wondered if he had chosen the right path, this was why he did what he did. For small gestures, for small miracles, for a girl who held a doll and a piece of paper full of scribbles, without knowing that she herself was proof that he had chosen the right path. Life could be cruel, but love in the simplest details could still win out, and Ethan knew at that moment that he would never forget that day. Camila's past would never disappear. There were nights when she would wake up with a start, her heart beating fast, as if she were still trapped in those cold walls of fear. There were days when she would watch Sophia play and feel a lump in her throat, remembering how she had almost lost her daughter forever. But now, fear no longer defined her life, because, over time, she realized that every pain she carried could be used to prevent other women from experiencing the same thing. And so, her new mission was born. Camila knew she couldn't change the past, but she could change someone's future. She started small, helping women who came to the community shelter, guiding them, listening to them, offering a shoulder to those who no longer had the strength to go on. Little by little, the idea took shape, and with the support of Valeria and others who believed in her, the shelter began to become a reality. It was a simple place with makeshift rooms, donated mattresses, and hastily painted walls. But for the women who arrived there, it was more than enough because for the first time, they were safe. For the first time, they could breathe without fear. And Camila saw in each of them a reflection of who she once was. Women who arrived with their faces covered in bruises. Mothers holding their children with nowhere to go. Young women who never imagined they would fall into this cycle, but now did not know how to escape. And they all had the same question in their eyes. Can I get out of this? Camila took their hands and answered without hesitation, yes, you can. I am proof of that. Little by little, she saw how their stories changed. She saw women who arrived with nothing rebuild their lives. She saw mothers who no longer had hope give their children a safe home. She saw that she was not alone in this struggle, because more than a shelter, she was creating a support network, a circle of strength, a new beginning for many people who believed there was no way out. The night after putting Sophia to bed, Camila sat on the terrace of the shelter and looked at the stars. The cold wind touched her face, but she no longer felt small in the face of the world. Valeria sat down next to her and sighed. Do you realize what you've done, Camila? She smiled. What do you mean? Valeria looked toward the shelter where some women were talking, where children slept without fear, where lives were being rebuilt. You turned your pain into a shelter for other people. You created a place where no woman has to go through what you went through. Camila took a deep breath. For so long she had felt powerless. For so long she had thought she would never escape. But now she was living proof that it was possible to start over. She looked at her sister, then at the sky, and smiled. I just did what I would have liked them to do for me. And for the first time, she felt that her past no longer defined her, because now she was changing the future. The morning was clear, but Ethan couldn't tell if it was the sunlight or the excitement inside him that made his chest feel so warm. He didn't know what to expect. He only knew that this day was not just any day. Camila's shelter was being officially inaugurated, and he couldn't miss it. He arrived early and stood in front of the entrance, observing. It was a simple building, nothing luxurious, but full of meaning. The walls were painted in bright colors, with drawings made by children who had once lived in fear. There were flowers in the windows, signs that said, "You are not alone." And above the main door was a name written delicately, but with the strength of someone who had survived. New Hope Home. People began to arrive, women who had once been rescued, children who now ran free without fear. And in the midst of it all, Camila wore a light blue dress and had a sparkle in her eyes that Ethan had never seen before. It was the sparkle of someone who finally knew who she was. Sophia stood next to her mother, holding her little hand and watching everything with curiosity. She still did not fully understand what that place meant, but someday she would understand. Someday she would know that her mother had turned pain into strength. When Camila climbed onto the small stage set up in front of the shelter, the murmur of conversation died down until silence filled the space. She held the microphone with steady hands, took a deep breath, and looked at the people in front of her. For years, I lived in fear. I believed there was no way out. Her gaze turned to Sophia, and her voice trembled slightly. I thought I would never get a second chance. She swallowed hard, closing her eyes for a second before continuing. But someone believed in me when I no longer believed in myself. She looked at Ethan, and he felt a lump in his throat. And today, I am here not only for myself, but for all the women who still need help, for all the children who deserve to grow up without fear. She took a deep breath. This shelter is for all of them. There was a wave of applause. Camila smiled excitedly and looked at Sophia, who squeezed her little hand in response. Then, with a small pair of scissors, she cut the red ribbon that marked the inauguration. The shelter was officially open, and Ethan, who remained standing among the crowd, couldn't contain his smile because he knew. He knew that Camila and Sophia were examples of courage. He knew that this day was not just the beginning of a new space, but the beginning of new stories. Above all, he knew that it had all started with a single decision. He had walked into that room, asked the right questions, and because of that, lives had been changed forever. The event continued with warm hugs, quiet laughter, and looks full of emotion. There was something in the air, It wasn't just happiness about the opening of the shelter. It was something deeper, something Ethan couldn't explain, but he felt it in detail in the way the women looked at each other and recognized themselves in each other's pain, in the shy smiles of the children who were in a safe place for the first time, and above all, in the sparkle in Camila's eyes. She was no longer the fragile woman he had found that night in the hospital. Now, she was a leader, a voice for those who could not yet speak, living proof that no matter how difficult things may seem, there is always a new beginning. When the ceremony was about to end, Camila took the microphone again. The crowd gradually fell silent. She looked around, took a deep breath, and then her eyes met Ethan's. For a moment he knew something was about to happen. "Before I finish, I need to thank a special person." She paused, as if organizing the words inside her chest. "Many people look at me today and see strength, but the truth is that I wasn't always strong." There was a deep silence. Camila continued, "There was a time when I didn't think it was worth going on, when I saw myself as someone who was broken, with no future, no way out." She squeezed the microphone. "But someone saw something in me that I couldn't see myself." Camila looked at Ethan. "If it weren't for you, Ethan, I wouldn't be here today." He felt his heart beat faster. "You didn't just save my life. You saved my daughter's life. You gave us back the chance to live." She smiled through the tears that were already beginning to fall. "You gave us back our lives." The silence was broken by a muffled sound, the sound of dozens of people crying, "Of my daughter. You gave us back the chance to live." She smiled through tears that were already beginning to fall. "You gave us back our lives." The silence was broken by a muffled sound, the sound of dozens of people crying, the sound of something much greater than gratitude. It was the sound of a story that would never be forgotten. Ethan tried to take a deep breath, but it was useless. The tears came before he could stop them. It wasn't sadness, it wasn't pain, it was something else great. He had never imagined the impact that a single decision would have that night. He could have kept walking. He could have ignored the half-open door. He could have not questioned the man next to Camila. He could have not listened to the voice inside him that said something was wrong. But he went in, and because of that, a woman had a second chance. A girl did not grow up without her mother. A shelter was created to save many other lives. He spent years believing that saving lives only meant preventing a heart from stopping. But now he understood that saving lives was much more than that. It was changing destinies, giving someone the opportunity to start over, and above all, it was making someone who thought they were alone discover that they were not. Camila came down from the stage and walked towards him. She said nothing. She just took his hands. And Ethan, who always had words for everything, for the first time in his life did not need to say anything, because in that moment he knew that some stories never end, and this one was just the beginning. Camila's words still echoed inside Ethan. "You gave us back our lives." He tried to take a deep breath. He tried to contain his emotions, but it was impossible. Tears burned his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he let them fall. Not out of sadness, not out of pain, but out of something much greater: realization. He spent years studying medicine, believing that his role was to heal bodies, alleviate symptoms, and bring physical relief. But there, in front of Camila and Sophia, he realized that medicine went much further than that. Saving a life was not just about preventing a heart from stopping beating. It was about giving someone the chance to start over. It was about taking someone's hand in their darkest moment and saying, "I am here." It was about being the voice of those who were silenced. It was about fighting for someone when that person no longer had the strength to fight for themselves. He looked around. The shelter was full of women who once believed they had no way out. Women who had arrived there broken and without hope. And now they were laughing, telling their stories, helping others who arrived because their pain had become strength. Ethan understood something that changed everything. Medicine saved bodies, but love, empathy, and courage saved souls. Sophia ran toward him, still hugging her doll, and took his hand. "You're crying, Dr. Ethan." He laughed softly, wiping his eyes a little. She smiled innocently. "Why are you sad?" She crouched down to his level. "No, Sophia, I'm happy." She tilted her head. "Then why are you crying?" He thought for a moment, then smiled and ruffled her hair affectionately. "Because sometimes, when something is very beautiful, we can't help but cry." Sophia gave him a big smile and hugged him tightly, and Ethan closed his eyes, feeling her little heart beating against his chest. At that moment, he knew everything was worth it. Every sleepless night, every doubt, every risk, every tear he held back, every decision he made without knowing if it was the right one. Everything led to that moment, that instant, when he knew he had saved something greater than a life. He had given Camila and Sophia the opportunity to start over, and now he knew that was the true purpose of medicine, not only to save bodies, but to save souls. Time passed. The mornings felt lighter. The nights were no longer so long. The fear did not disappear completely, but it was no longer the center of everything. Now there was Lear, but the past was still there. Camila had scars, marks that no one could see but that she felt every day. Sometimes, when she heard a loud noise, her heart still raced. There were moments when she woke up in the middle of the night, breathing heavily, as if she were still trapped in that house that had once been her prison. But the difference now was that she was no longer alone. Sophia still held her hand a little tighter when they walked down the street together. She still had nightmares from time to time, whispering softly in the night, "Mommy." And every time, Camila was there, taking her little hand and saying with all the certainty in the world, "I'm here," because above all, Sophia would never have to be afraid again. Ethan also changed. He was still in the hospital, facing endless shifts, studying late into the night, dealing with emergencies that made him wonder if he was on the right path. But now, he saw everything with different eyes, because he knew that saving a life was not just about preventing death. It was about giving someone a second chance. And every time he received a message from Camila telling him about a woman who had arrived at the shelter, every time Sophia showed up during his visits with a new drawing, scribbled with all the love in the world, he remembered why he chose to be a doctor, not only to heal bodies, but to save souls. One day, Camila and Ethan were sitting on the terrace of the shelter watching Sophia play with other children. The sun gilded the late afternoon, and the cool breeze brought a peace that was difficult to explain. Camila ran her fingers over a small scar on her arm. "Do you think the scars will ever disappear?" Ethan looked at her. He knew she wasn't just talking about the marks on her skin. "No, but one day they'll stop hurting." She looked at him for a moment, and then smiled, because for the first time, she knew he was right. The scars wouldn't disappear, but now they told a different story. A story of strength, new beginnings, love, and above all, hope. Now I want to know what you would do in Ethan's place. Would you have noticed that something was wrong in Camila's room? Or if you were Camila, would you have found the strength to start over? Write your opinion in the comments. I'd love to read it. And if this story moved you, click the bell so you don't miss the next videos, because there are many real and moving stories coming up. Now, if you want to continue to move us with a story that has already made many people cry and reflect, you can't miss it.